This is Dave Monk at Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. This is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at the environment, rails, trails, and white greenways today, and everything else that Dave is in the mood to talk about. This is Sunday, March the 25th, 2018, and I have a really quick bicycling report. Not a good day for bicycling. You probably guessed that. If you can get quickly over to, wait for it, University Avenue, it's beautiful until you hit the occasional bit of slush. So if you're comfortable bicycling where you're guaranteed to have traffic around you, and I presume that's going to be true of State Street going the other direction. It actually is not awful, but still probably not your first mode of transportation if you can catch a bus or something.
It's not slippery, I don't think. I think it's powdery snow. Or sloppy snow.
Here's the problem. If the street is just wet, given that the temperature is way below freezing, you're going to hit ice patches. And it actually almost happened on University even. There was one place where they didn't plow as well as they did the rest of the street. And at an intersection, I had to signal the car behind me that I was going to stop in the lane, and they whipped around me. Anyway, so yes, given that I'm going to be downtown past when the buses stop, I didn't have an option. I had to bike today, but maybe not the best for people. Certainly not just for fun. That's it. What's on the schedule for today, Dave?
Well, I have several notifications. The Natural Area Study Group meets on Tuesdays at 9 o'clock at the Anita Purvis Center, but they're going to Meadowbrook Park this week. And I kind of enjoy them doing that because Meadowbrook Park may look simple, but it has been created out of farmland, and it has various different categories of prairie preservation. There's a nice overview pavilion. There's an attempt to put photographs of prairie plants there so that you can get an idea of the biodiversity. It's just an interesting place where people should know. And the Natural Area Study Group has been going for probably over 30 years, and it keeps getting people joining. And they must have about 30 or more people who don't always turn up to the trails, but they come to meetings, and I like to see them do that. We lost one person recently. Ruth Walker would come to those sorts of meetings and sometimes to field trips, and she just passed. I had people calling up to burn before the snow. That's leaving it a little late. The question is, could you do that? Yes, you can. If you want to burn an area that's farmland prairie, that's okay. But if you're going to be near to houses, you have to know that this is a fairly responsible thing, and you can easily burn houses if you're not careful, and you need enough people to do that. I referred to the question to the Grand Prairie Friends because they do have equipment. I don't think they want to do prairie burns for everyone, but certainly they're willing to do prairie burns when it's important to do same. Jamie Ellis is president, and you can get hold of him there. Don't have his phone number right here, but he's contactable, and Prairie Friends does that. Prairie Friends has a tree planting day in Coles County, and that will be on Ooh, I think it's April. Do I have it? It's April 7 at 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's not an overly burdensome time frame, and it's in Cole County. You can get there by going straight down 130 to Charleston, and then taking 130 further south to the lake, and a few wiggle woggles there, and you're into Warbler Woods and other places that they've been working on for quite some time, and they've successfully now got something like 400 acres of forested area there. So CCDC is having an annual meeting in April the 15th. CCDC was put together by Susan Stone and Natalie Alpert, some probably 30-odd years ago, might be more than that. And they felt that Champaign County needed some landscape type of concern, and they've been doing that for years. They will meet at the I Hotel on it's on First Street and the little road that goes through the agriculture there. So oh, I know what I was going to say something about. The WEFT had an evening for dealing with stuffing envelopes. And that was kind of interesting. It's a little bit like other groups where you get together, like quilting groups get together. But one of the things they do is they natter about things, and apparently the concern, one of the concerns was for the pocket prairie. And so I was doing some things with garbage, and so the interaction there I thought was very good. So Laurie Coey has been writing to the agency that's doing the development of the building there, and I've been there too, and other people have been writing and getting some very positive responses. So it might be that we get to have a little bit of niche prairie there, which would be very good. It's been a nice spot for introducing people to prairie, and it's a sort of a relaxing place. You can go and read a book there. It's beginning to grow right now, and usually landscape people don't get to be involved till the building is remodeled. That is very disappointing to the landscape people, because they would like to be part of the overall building plan. So we might be able to change that a little bit. There's a suggestion that Johns might get involved. He's a landscape architect that works with Clark Lindsay. We need to not only suggest that we're disappointed to lose the prairie, but then you have the opportunity to make a suggestion. And sometimes those suggestions are very viable. They might be changed, but it gives a groundswell for some introduction to leaving little plots of land around that are interesting. I was just listening to a program that was talking about Holland and the fact that a city can become a tourist venue without necessarily having a grand plan. You can have a lot of people, and we have in downtown Champaign really a lot of people and they're Parisianized. They can sit out on the street, and they get together, and it's very positive. But there's also a need for an art place. I was disappointed to see that the university pulled out their art gallery, but there's little nooks and places that a city should have that give it character. And so you need something more than just the Holland situation with Amsterdam, and they're getting upset that a lot of tourists come for a drink. They don't stay. They're not tourists that are going to be there for 2 or 3 days. They're there for 1 day, and they managed to have figured out how to do that without much cost. And the feeling is that you need something positive that's much more than a daily visit by people who don't necessarily have a lot of commitment to the area. What do you do with the locals? Where is the bread shop? Where is the antique store? Where is the places where the locals are involved? And we have a lot of locals, a lot of apartments. So evil-mindedly, I'm thinking that we really need our historic trains to get into Champagne. We need the bicycles to get through from the Kickapoo Trail to West Champagne, and I'll go on with that more lately. The CH&W has a day. Oh, I didn't bring my notebook. It's on the Saturday. It's either the 31st or the 30th. It's a work day. The CH&W is the Champagne, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad. And what the attempt is there, and Tom Scott has been a leader in this. He's a railroad engineer and drives trains for the Railroad Museum, is a part of the Railroad Museum, and his leadership has taken to getting an easement from Heartland Pathways to re-rail 4 miles of abandoned railroad bed, put in a bridge that was taken out for liability reasons, and get historic trains into Champagne. If you do that, you're going to have responsible rails, because steam engines are heavy. They have big wheels, and there's few of them. So this is not like the more modern diesel trains that have many axles and spread the weight. So if you're going to do historic trains, you're probably having to make sure that the bridges are good and stable. So we've been looking at bridges in the Arcola area, and Tom's got one bridge from a rail trail we're losing there to replace the abutments. So you have a bridge where you need a bridge to go across the river, and it needs to be long enough so that you don't have a peg leg in the Camp Creek. Camp Creek empties 10 square miles there, so in a good rainstorm it's a flowing river. So you need a bridge that has abutments that are probably trestle-like, and then a long enough span to get across the river without having a leg in the middle, which it happens often, but it collects trees and junk that are coming down the river. So Tom has organized it's on a weekend, spring break area, but he has railroad engineering students coming, and it'll be at White Heath. If you go to the east side of White Heath, you would probably find an interesting experience there, just to see how you would go about putting in rails. Mostly we're taking out rails, but in this case we're putting them back. And so there's some historic involvement in taking ties and putting them down and setting them in the ballast and getting them level and putting down rails. The rails are 33 feet long, and you got to be able to lift them. If in the past you had tongs, and if you had 10 people with tongs, you could lift a rail and put it in place. You could also put it in place and pin it down and then move it an inch or so, or even just an eighth of an inch. You have to have those rails have to be very perfectly gauged. So, and you have the fun of, I don't know whether Tom's into this, but you had gandy dancers. These were people who had to put in the spikes and move the rail, and you do it according to song and dance. So you would have a foreman who would sing, and if you were moving the line around by an eighth of an inch, you would have a certain sort of song. If you were having to move it a foot, you would have again a different song. So yeah, it's just doing that and having the realization that this is a railroad museum that has 7 miles of trackage, and it's contiguous with our abandoned 4 miles, which preserves prairie, and this also involves an adjacent interurban, which could be a trail. And you've heard this song and dance before, but that's okay. We have to let the public know that we have resources out there. So what else do I have? Tree planting?
Jumping in really quickly, you said it's next Saturday, a week from yesterday?
Yes.
So that'll be the 31st.
31st.
No,
Okay.
April 1st is April Fool's Day and Easter next Sunday.
Okay. Thank you. I had calls from people who want to burn. I think I might have mentioned that already. Okay. And I hope they got burned before it rained and snowed. But, it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of snow on your area that you're burning. It's not every creature that lives in the prairie likes to be burned. So we tend to not burn a site completely. We always leave some parts for those creatures that don't enjoy being burned. But basically, whether it's prairie or forest, burning helps to keep that alive, because the lightning strikes over the years have taught the habitat that burning is part of this reality, and they're mostly have adapted to that reality over the centuries. So now, if you don't burn the territory, it accumulates litter. You have fires like you do in California, and people like to be in natural areas, but they don't like to burn. But if you part of your ecology is burning, then you have to pay homage to that. So, okay, the little things that happened over the week, and rather nice. I like the piece from Weft, because it's not just, say, a group of people protesting the loss of something we cherish. It's a sensible writing in and suggesting of some alternatives, and I think that has received a pleasant response. So, we've been talking about agencies that deal with natural areas, historic areas, railroads. There's a whole lot of these things at a national level. We have spent some time following George Fell through, and he was a founder of the Nature Conservancy, and so I want to continue with that. I want to try and say the next level is it's complex, and we don't know it all. And people who are willing to help with what some of us are involved in don't always know the structures and how to go about it, and who lobbies who, and and what is involved, and can you do something with 50 people taking tires out of the landfill, or out of the rivers or creeks or whatever? That's good, but there are things like the Kickapoo Trail or historic buildings that need an understanding of the system to which they belong. At the federal level, for instance, with rail trails, you have the involvement of a Rail Banking Act. So you have Congress, and you have formal organizations like the Surface Transportation Board, and you go about trying to preserve railroads. You have official agencies, but you also have private agencies or organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Foundation, a whole bunch of those groups are there, and they can be very effective in backing and forthing with the government regulations and engineers that are involved with putting in bridges or doing preparation of trails. And so you need to be able to get these people together, and over, it involves talking to people. It's all good and well to have an inch-high plan to do things, but somehow that plan has to involve all the parties that are these stakeholders. How do you get them together? It's tremendously difficult. It's like herding cats. If there's been several attempts, I would say probably in the last 30 years, there's probably been 10 attempts to get all the natural history groups together. It doesn't always work unless there's some sort of crisis, like a landfill that's putting PVCs into the landfill, and it gets pretty scungy when the landfill's on top of an aquifer, and so then you have some concern. There has been over the years an increasing involvement with planning and things like that, and that's looked on very reservedly, because who's telling who to do what with my land, and so this is touchy territory often. I thought I might go through some of the state agencies. We mentioned some of them last week. You have the Department of Natural Resources, which used to be the Department of Conservation. You have a Nature Preserves Commission. You have a Natural Lands Institute. You have an Illinois inventory of the various ecosystems and little portions that have been preserved. So you have a welter of state agencies, if you can know where they are and where you can find them. We have Audubon, which deals with birds, but birds have to have habitats, and so Audubon has over the years been instrumental in doing that sort of thing. We have the Sierra Club, which sort of comes in from the West Coast, and where Muir and others were preserving the dignity of areas around San Francisco, and there's an area of politicking there. So that's a different organization. Then there's Isaac Walton League, which is a club that kind of puts itself together according to what it wants to do. If it's in some places, it might be a beer drinking club, and other places it might be a conservation organization. Always very hard to keep them together, because people are spread fairly thin, and these are organizations that put money into working with natural areas and and it involves a certain expertise. So you're very dependent on people who have a knowledge of how to do this. So there are native plant societies. There's a CCDC, which we just mentioned. There's Grand Prairie Friends. There's a Natural Area Study Group, which will be at the Meadowbrook Park tomorrow morning. There's the CH&W, the railroad bed that we're talking about, that might bring historic trains to Champaign. We have forest preserves and conservation districts. So we talked about that a little bit, but you have to know that the forest preserve, all the counties in Illinois had a chance to do a forest preserve, but they're not as organized to conservation as the thing that replaced them, which was the conservation district. So locally we have a forest preserve in a county which is basically 94% prairie, and Vermilion County, which is next door, has a conservation district, which is allows for more recognition of the natural history of the county, and it is not quite as dramatically organized to recreation. So there are foundations. There are the Land Conservation Foundation locally, the Clean Energy Foundation at the state level, Vital Lands at the state level. You have politicking groups that lobby, like the Illinois Environmental Council. You have university, which controls things like now the Natural History Survey and several other surveys. You have libraries like the Urbana Free Library that takes on a lot of responsibilities that are unique to Urbana or to the Urbana Free Library. It stores a lot of the records for the counties, and it distributes a lot of information. Instant the fact that we're on camera at the present time, run by the city of Urbana, so the program goes up not only on radio, it goes on television and then goes to YouTube, and then it also goes to the Urbana Free Library and can be accessed in 20 years or 100 years or whatever, when people are looking for what happened in the past and what they might do in the future. The cities get involved. So the camera that we're using is an Urbana city camera, and the people who work with it, like Jason Liggett, are knowledgeable in how to get involved, not only in Urbana, but also in Champaign. So now I want to look at a local project, because we have 33 miles of railroad bed sitting out there in the Monticello area, and we talk about it all the time, but it has a problem in that not very many people know how to find it. In fact, when we have students to find us and other people to find us, they really have trouble finding us. That's partially because our prairies look like weeds, and there's nothing dramatic there to say this is a prairie. But we've been talking about the natural history locally, and a lot of it goes back to talking about George Fell and the Nature Conservancy, but I have to think about the people who were there early. Early on, there was a botanist named Gleason, and he documented a lot of the prairies in Champaign County and in the state. And especially he went over to Mason County and discovered plants growing on sand dunes. And so just a welter of stuff, and we don't know those places anymore. They've been taken over for corn and soybeans. Even the sand dunes can be irrigated, and and grow crops. So there's a need to watch this. Vestal and Shelford were people who came along early and got involved in trying to preserve some of these sites, and Kendi followed. So these are all people that have long since gone. But when I stand on the railroad bed, the Kickapoo railroad bed, and look from Urbana to Mayview Cemetery, I am very cognizant that that area was used by early ecological people. I'm aware that the area between Urbana and Mayview was used by these people. Shelford created an ecological union. It goes back almost to the era of Coles. Coles was working with the dunes on Lake Michigan, and sort of was one of our first ecologists. Some of these people were a little on the outrageous side. We have, for instance, Cyril Hopkins, who came here doing soils when the USDA would not really, didn't really want to do that. So we benefited from that, and so we can talk about Katinas with dry soils on the top going down to Drummers and Flanagan's on the flat. So Coles was there very early. His daughter, May Watt, was also a landscape person and an ecologist. And so going back to that area, you have early on, very early on, Gleason, and then Vestal, and then Shelford, and Kendi. And guess who was a student of Kendi's and Shelford? It was George Fell, who put together the Nature Conservancy. So we have that sort of history. We have Forbes, who put together the Natural History Survey. And I really feel that people ought to know that. And I stand and take a photograph of the Kickapoo Trail, and I think of especially Shelford and Kendi, who used that corridor for its natural history, particularly Prairie. And then guess who was their student? It was George Fell, who then eventually working with Shelford and Kendi, they changed it to the Nature Conservancy. George went off to Washington and was there for 7 years until somebody else, he retired from that. We've dealt with that sort of thing. But so some of the energy was right here. And I stand on the bridge east of St. Joe and take a photograph of that railroad bed, what used to be the New York Central and eventually was Conrail, and I see remnant soil and remnant prairie there, and I want to see a narrower trail. And it's part of our history, and I'm kind of sad to see that we have sort of exterminated the first 7 miles, except for 1 mile, which is a police road very near to St. Joe, which does have good remnant prairie on it. But we need to try and educate engineers and others. I keep trying to contact the Surface Transportation Board to see who makes the specifications for these trails, and do they always have to be 10 feet wide with 2 feet on either side of gravel, and then down the slopes or near the slopes of the prairie on either side. Can we change it? I'm not sure, but at least we should try. So taking that concept of a trail that has been established, one of the reasons why we did it was that Shelford and others went over to Danville and they documented the ponds that were created by mining, strip mining. So you had ponds of different age. You have a rolling territory. You have geology that includes faults and coal underneath. And so you have a cultural difference because of the people who came to do the mining, probably mainly from Kentucky and places like that. So before you ever dare to take on a railroad bed for future use as a trail, you have to think about what is the use of this. It drops into Kickapoo State Park, which has a lot of this sort of strip mining, but it has interesting rivers, one of which is a clean river, and people have worked at that. And how do you balance all that out? So going from that, where we do have the Rail Banking Act and an interim trail use agreement, which helps to save that railroad bed, and it runs from a county that's basically all prairie to a site that is more rolling and sort of site where Native Americans could retreat from the prairie back into a protected place during the winter. So knowing all that, we also have a Heartland Pathways rail trail, which is rather similar, but with a different set of sort of interests. And we've talked about this a little bit. You have a city of Monticello, which is kind of unique in that it was settled on the river. It had a grist mill and a lumber mill a little further away. That was the early settlement. And then that morphed into a county seat, Piatt County seat, Piatt family. And you have the Sangamon River coming through, you have the Cerro Gordo Moraine, so you have Allerton Park, and the early history of what made it possible to buy that ground was that Sam Allerton worked with the Civil War and provided food. And so we have a history of Lodge Park where you can take a car and wander through on the banks of the Sangamon and see the early spring herbs that are starting to come out right away. You have a railroad museum, which is national level railroad museum. Just a lot of people who are genuinely a part of Monticello. It's just 25 miles from Champaign-Urbana and the University of Illinois, so it's just far enough away from town to be independent. And there's that sort of nicety. So knowing some of these things, we bought 33-mile railroad bed. It's sitting there. It's doing its job by just being there, just preserving the nature on either side. And I'm thinking that it's time we did some field trips. We have the the background of the Kickapoo Trail. The first phase of the Kickapoo Trail has been so well used that we have confidence that our areas to the west will also be more appreciated. Not that they're not appreciated, but it is always very tempting to invade from either side to have a few more rows of corn. But basically, the farmers have been very respectful of the fact that we have that area. And so I just have been putting together a concept. We need a plan of what is possible, and we need people to see it. And we need people to see it who also have their own ideas about what this agency could be. So I just quickly thought, well, let's start off with a field trip in downtown. It might be just a vehicle with a bicycle rack on it, and we might have 2 or 3 people. You don't have to have a lot of people to know what we're talking about. We just start off right here next to Weft, next to the Pocket Prairie. We might take a moment to think about the MTD, the Canadian National Railroad, the downtown Champaign, and the role of Pocket Prairie. Then we would go to Walnut Street and downtown, and people can think about tall buildings and complexes and people occupying various bars. And what do we do? Then we go to Washington Street, and there's PACA, the Preservation and Conservation Association, which has a lot to do with salvaging old buildings and keeping other buildings together. And they've been at that for years. They have often supported me to go to North American Prairie conferences. Then we take Washington west to Neal Street and to the post office, and then we waddle west. And what you're doing there is looking at the 2 railroads coming in, one from Bloomington, which is the Norfolk Southern Railroad, and one from Kraft Co., and it used to come in from Monticello, to an area between State and Randolph Street, which is where those 2 railroads meet and can they join and go out onto the main line. It used to be a second line there that came out independently, and that we might use for a bicycle way. This needs people to dream, but they need to know where it is. And this is not Heartland Pathways yet. This is figuring out how you would get Heartland Pathways into town. Could you use the adjacent territory for getting bicycles in and out of Champaign to something like Allerton Park and Monticello? It needs people to know how to do that. There's a big area on State Street, just where the railroad line swings around and the Canadian National goes on to Norfolk Southern for a while and then goes out to the main line. There was a ice factory, and that has been removed, and I think that will be a part of a detention pond there at some stage. But there's open space, it's probably about 1.5 acres, and it could be a place for venues. So we look at that, and then we travel along that line. It goes near to Sholem Park, and so you have to figure out how do you get a bicycle along there. Across Prospect Avenue, there's a little bar there, and there's an area which is wide enough for a bicycle way. There's actually a road down there. So you get to a concrete construction company which makes pipes and things like that. And how could you go through there? How can you go through behind Kraft Humco and without causing conflict with the railroad? And then a little further west is a casting company, and it has a spur line there that you have to deal with. And so now you're at Mattis Avenue, and you're thinking about how do you get through to Kaufman Lake, and then how do you get a bicycle way across to at Duncan Road, near to Prairie Gardens. And there's a little railroad line that used to run up to an engineering company that is there. That there's now a trail for that has been put together by the Park District. And parks are really into this sort of thing. So we now are at the at Duncan Road, and you're going west to Bonneville and Seymour. At the moment, there's rail traffic to a gravel company there, so there's a need for a little bit of backup line. There's a plastic company that takes in plastic by rail, and there's an I-57 overpass. So at the moment, if you go past there, if we were looking at a field trip, we would stop and observe that there's a blocker on the railroad line. That means that if a railroad car is pushed too far, then it's derailed. And so this means that it's 10 miles between 57 and Seymour that has rails on it, but it's considered for abandonment. How do we look at that area? Well, Tom Scott is working on that, and he's been very diligent. The whole family has been involved with the Monticello Railroad Museum, and this is independent. If we do things with, and I say we because 4 miles of this is Heartland Pathways purchase, and that's the first segment. There's Heartland Pathways is in 3 segments, and so the people in my hypothetical field trip have to realize that Seymour and Bonneville are small elevators, comparatively speaking. The rent has gone up higher, and they are on the road. Part of the problem is that they don't have a railroad weighbridge. They have a weighbridge for grain coming in to their bins, but when you are selling grain, and there's small lots, this is not 125 cars, it's more like 15 cars or 20 cars, it's going to a different sort of groups that buy it. And one of the groups is chicken farmers in the south. And they don't have a weighbridge either. So if you need to know what's in that 100-ton grain car, you need to weigh it. So one of the problems why that is an abandoning line at the present time is because there's not a weighbridge there. So the first concern is 3 miles between Seymour and Bonneville, and then between Bonneville and 57 overpass. That is about 10 miles in all. Bonneville has been using the rails positively for more recently than Seymour. But both of them are now on the road. And you have to know that there's an energy issue here. The railroads do their 500 miles with 1 gallon of gas, 1 ton of freight. It takes commodities in a better way than if you put them on the road, and the roads are kind of subject to destruction by a lot of this sort of putting heavy material on roads that are not necessarily highways, and even highways are subject to damage. Okay, so we're looking at 10 mile of rail that's intact, and then we're looking at 4 miles that's not intact. It's being re-railed. We would guess that to buy that rail bed, it might be as much as $1 million. Not unusual if you look at the rail trail construction and Kickapoo. It's $12 million assigned from the Rail Banking Act. In this case, if you're dealing with grain, you can't have an interim trail use. It's actually in use. And so how do you balance commercial with historic trains? And how would you reinstate the use of these elevators with rail by perhaps contributing to a weighbridge that might cost you $200,000 to put it in? So my trip will do that. We have a warehouse at Bonneville, and you have to figure out when we work with people, we need workspace. So Tom Scott is having a workshop on the 31st at the White Heath end, but if we acquire this line for grain and recreational railroading, historic railroading, then we'll have to figure out whether people are prepared to contribute to the 3 miles between Seymour and Bonneville, and then between Bonneville and I-57. Okay, that railroad bed then becomes Heartland Pathways, and we have an easement for the 4 miles there for the Chicago, Havana, and Western Railroad, and they're well into re-railing that right now. There's also a parallel interurban that could be a trail. So how do you get into Monticello? And then there's contiguity with Monticello Railroad Museum. And another part of the railroad bed goes off to Clinton and crosses the Sangamon, and it's another interesting territory. So it's getting to be the end of the time I have. So you have 3 areas. One is between Whiteheath and Seymour. One is between Monticello and along by Allerton Park to Cisco, and one between Whiteheath and Clinton. And it behooves us to be responsible to demonstrate what is its capacity, and what would be suggestions for the future, and to invite people to contribute their own energy and interest in trying to preserve it, trying to actually pay for the cost of acquiring it in the first place, and interpreting it, and getting it through all these agencies that we've been talking about. So this is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.